All right, well, good evening. I want to welcome everyone to the service again, both those that are here as well as those that are streaming with us online. So tonight we are continuing on with the history of modern Israel. Tonight we're in part 9. Hard to believe we're 9 things in, and we're now just getting to the creation of the nation of Israel. It took all that time just to build up all the story beforehand. But if you remember at the end of part 8, it was the World War II aftermath. We still had a lot of the sniping and fighting and stuff going on inside of Palestine. And the UN had their special commission that had come in and recommended the two-state solution partition plan. And so that's where we're taking it up now. After that, their plan was put forth. They went with was UN Resolution 181 at that time, which happened on November 29th, 1947. So this was taking the plan that was given and going for a vote on it. Called for the creation of the two different states, as well as that international region around Jerusalem. That was done because there was a lot of holy sites there for both, Jewish and for Arabs, and so they wanted to make sure that had a special area in there just for Jerusalem that didn't belong to either state. It called for Britain to leave by August 1st, 1948. 33 countries voted for it, and 13 voted against, and 10 abstained. And so it passed that UN resolution. However, because the Jewish leaders accepted it and the Arab leaders did not, it started a civil war that was going on, or it went on in Palestine. And so that plan from UN Resolution 181 never got implemented. British was still in the position to start pulling out, and so they were still on the hook for trying to keep the peace. And if you remember, just all the sniping that was before, the difference that started now and why this called a civil war was because it wasn't just factions going around. Instead, this became more and more militarized, where there was military campaigns that had objectives going out and all that. And so it just increasingly started being built up. So it was no longer just, citizens doing on their own. It became a full-out Palestinian civil war at the time. It didn't stop them, though. Later, in May 14th, 1948, David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of Israel at the time, he proclaimed the Israeli Declaration of Independence. U.S. President Harry Truman recognized that nation 11 minutes after that declaration. And it's interesting, too, that he did it completely against the U.S. State Department. They all were advising him not to do that. And part of that was they didn't want to anger, again, all the Arab nations that were around, the 13 that voted against the UN resolution at that time. And they wanted to protect a lot of the oil interest, that they had in that area as well. But Truman went ahead and recognized them and made sure it was very well known at that time, too. Interesting also that the second country to recognize Israel as a nation was Iran. And that was an Arab nation. They actually had voted against the UN resolution that was there, but they were a democratically elected country at that time. Their president was democratically elected. That didn't change till 4 years later when the U.S. and Britain got involved again around oil, but that's a story for a different time. And then a few other nations also recognized them, and the Soviet Union recognized them a few days later on May 17th. And that was a surprise to some, but the Soviet Union actually had some thought that they would be able to turn Israel into a communist nation. And so they thought that if they supported at the time, there may be chances for that. The Palestinians at the time referred to that day as the catastrophe. They did not like Israel being recognized because, again, they were trying to get rid of them altogether. David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the values of Israel, and just lost the slide. And I thought this was interesting, so I'm going to read it. It says, "The state of Israel be open to the immigration of Jews from all countries of their dispersion, will promote development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants, will be based on the precepts of liberty, justice, and peace taught by the Hebrew prophets, will uphold the full social and political equality of all of its citizens without distinction of race, creed, or sex, will guarantee full freedom of conscience, worship, education, and culture, will safeguard and sanctify the inviolability of the shrines and holy places of all religions, and will dedicate itself to the principle of the Charter of the United Nations. We offer peace and unity to all neighboring states and their peoples, and invite them to cooperate with the independent Jewish nation for the common good of all." And David Ben-Gurion, before declaring the state of Israel, he was conflicted somewhat internally because he knew what the reaction would be for him doing this. But to him, it was an inevitability. It didn't matter whether it was doing here, now, a month from now, or years from now. He didn't see any way of stopping it, but their heart was exactly what they stated with the values of Israel and what they were stating beforehand. And he was correct on his prediction because the next day, the Arab League invaded. The Arab League had been around. It had started in 1922, and so it had been around for a while. But the 5 nations there, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, all declare war on Israel. Now, their stated reasons for going to war, they state in their release on it, they said that they find themselves compelled to intervene in order to restore law and order and to check further bloodshed. And it was true that, as the British were pulling out, and the Civil War started, there was a lot of bloodshed that was going on. But it's interesting that they talked about restoring the law and order on that. The second point, they put the mandate over Palestine has come to an end, leaving no legally constituted authority. So they rejected the United Nations, and all that. That was a legally authority that was given, by the vote of the United Nations, and they followed exactly what was done there, but they just left that off. And then the only solution to the Palestine problem is the establishment of a unitary Palestinian state. So again, they went exactly against what the world had come up with in the United Nations for a 2-state solution, and instead they would only accept a single solution, or a single state being only of Palestinian Arabs. The Ahmed Pasha, who was the Arab League Secretary General, he's Secretary General of basically the armies that are invading. Alec Kirkbride was visiting about a month or two beforehand, and he said he asked him for his estimate of the size of Jewish forces, and he waved his hands and says, "It does not matter how many there are, we will sweep them into the sea." A couple months later, he stated, "I personally wish that the Jews do not drive us to this war, as this will be a war of extermination, a momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades." So they weren't really there to restore law and order. It was the same thing of what Hitler was doing in World War II, the genocide, getting rid of that whole population, just sweeping them in the sea. And that's the leader making public statements along this line on there. The Arab League also had a lot of infighting. We've talked many times about the importance of unity and how unity is so crucial to getting things done and built up. And of the 5 different countries, King Abdullah of Jordan, he really wanted to be seen as the leader of the Arab League. He wanted to be the one that be known as the champion there. It was the newest state. Jordan had just become an official country in 1946. Again, they were around for in the British mandate for a while there. And he had done a lot, in Jordan and getting all the different tribes. A lot can be said about him. But he kept wanting to rise in power. And so he wanted to be seen as basically the leader of it. He also wanted to annex all the Arab parts of Palestine into Jordan. In fact, beforehand, he was having secret meetings with the British and others, trying to make his own different partition plan where he would expand the borders of Jordan, taking over a lot of Palestine in there. King Farouk of Egypt was jealous of King Abdullah and the influence that he was having, and he wanted to prevent Abdullah of Jordan from being seen as the leader of the Arab League. The Secretary General was an Egyptian at the time, and he didn't want to lose that power, that he had in Egypt, and he wanted to annex all of southern Palestine into Egypt. Instead of having a separate Palestinian state, he wanted it in Egypt. Also, the guy that's known as the strongman of Iraq, he wanted to bring the entire Fertile Crescent under Iraqi leadership. So again, he didn't want Abdullah or King Farouk to be known as the leaders. He wanted himself to be known as that, and so that's why he wanted a piece of the pie. And Syria and Lebanon both stated that they wanted to annex the territory in northern Palestine to grow their own lands. So none of these countries were really interested in creating an independent Palestinian state. Instead, they were all thinking, now that the British are pulling out, here is a free opportunity for us to grow our own influence and desires. So the Arab League failed miserably. All of their infighting and stuff. And if you remember, even in World War I, when T.E. Lawrence, the British military guy, was there, talking about how they would not stand a lot of organized fighting. Instead, they were great individual fighters, but they did not make very good armies. And that was seen very much, where even most of the battles and stuff that were fought, if you do a reading through some of that, a lot of the Palestinians, when they were coming into a battle, just assumed that they were going to lose on it too, when they came in, because that's how ill-prepared the things were. And so Israel just basically grew out of it. Israel emerged victorious in almost every way. The territory that they occupied went from the 58% or the 56%, sorry, that was listed in the UN resolution, to now that they had controlling parts of 78% of the territory. Jordan was marginally victorious because Jordan got to keep the West Bank area. So they added basically territory there. The Arab League later pressured them, and they said, oh, well, we're just keeping that for the time being. They weren't allowed really to annex it for good. But they certainly had an increase in the territory, that way. So it was marginally victorious for them. But the Arab League overall, the invasion, was just a complete strategic failure. They basically got none of the objectives of going into Israel. They lost a lot of territory, and at the end, they just had to settle for the armistice and stop the fighting. Because of the fighting, though, a lot of the Arab population that was in Palestine had left. They had gone to other countries nearby, just waiting for all the fighting to be done, thinking that they were going to win and be able to go back. And that created a huge problem then, just like end of World War II, all the displaced persons. There was a lot of Palestinian refugees at the end of this battle. And you can see that kind of in this population table. You have the 3 years in a row, 1946, 47, 48, then jump to 1950, then 1955. The Jewish population, again, when they became their own state, they were able to control immigration and all the backlog of the Jewish people from Europe who were trying to get there. It just opened up for them. And you can see the flip number from 1947 to 1948, that it went from 32% Jewish population to 82% Jewish population. And then by 1950 and 1955, it went to 88 and 89%. The population from 1948 to 1955 more than doubled, during that time. And that was just, again, from all the bringing in people from all over. And that takes us to the end of part 9.